As they felled the tree, they saw something they had never imagined. Both the lumberjack and her were so disturbed that they had to call the authorities. What did they see? The environmental damage caused by war was horrific. Bodies that have never been found have become overgrown with nature, mixing with body parts and the metals of armour to wreak havoc on the environment. Since the industrial age, manufactured wars have caused irreparable damage to the environment, but they are only one of many factors that damage our environment in meteorological ways. Could our interference be the possible cause of the environment's demise? Christine may have found the answer. The story of the tree is even older than her time in the house. It could be a tree bearing the scars of human hands or humanity itself. We have no idea, but in 1916, the plains of Verdun in France were one of many devastating scenes for humanity. Trenches, explosions and poisonous gases left their mark not only on the soldiers who fought, but also on the land itself. It is estimated that more than 1 million trees were reduced to ashes during the battle, and the rivers, contaminated with blood and chemicals, took decades to recover. These waters flowed into the sea, and where plants germinated, birds carried the seeds to other areas, affecting ecosystems in one way or another. The impact of human conflict on nature is a subject rarely mentioned in history books because it lacks the appeal of other topics. But whether we believe it or not, landscapes not only change over time, they sometimes hide the silent cries of past damage. Rotting bodies buried underground, grenades hidden under the ground, rusted tanks and abandoned trenches, all silent, empty and sad, show how war transforms nature into a stage for ambitions. In these places, there are only remnants which not only reshape the landscape, but also become a kind of collective grave, a fusion of metal and death that merges with the earth and makes it suffer. But what does this have to do with Christine? She's a woman in her 40s, someone who wasn't born into this era to live in the midst of such devastation. Yet she probably grew up surrounded by nature, perhaps in a more natural environment where she was taught to cultivate and care for it. Without realizing it, she was living in an environment shaped by these changes, a nature that may not have been entirely original. Apples, tomatoes, vegetables, they all grew, often enhanced with stimulants to make them bigger and tastier, though perhaps less healthy. The Industrial Revolution, which began centuries earlier, had already dealt the first blows to the environment. But the wars of the 20th century exacerbated the damage. Plants grew amid toxic factory smoke and chemicals that made them bigger but sterile. Even rivers, the main source of water, were affected. They filled with rainwater from the seas polluted and poisoned by chemicals and human waste. Every bomb dropped and every bullet fired scarred not only the people, but the trees, the water, and the land itself. Perhaps that's why Christine chose to move into a house with a very old tree, probably planted around 1915. It was old and showed signs of strength and resilience. In fact, she had a garden in this house that showed her knowledge of cultivation and care, with some crops thriving under her attention. And as the harvest season approached, so did the harsh reality that could reveal just how sad their surroundings really were. The effects of human action could shatter their subconscious fantasy of a natural tree. A long time ago, perhaps years or even decades ago, the fruit, the apples, had been beautiful, shiny, and, above all, bright red. They weren't as big as the artificially enhanced ones, but they were lovely. As always, Christine eagerly awaited each season to pick them. But this time, when she touched the apples, their skin was wrinkled and mottled with dark spots, and as soon as she handled them, they crumbled into a soft, foul-smelling mush. Anyone would grimace in disgust at such a stench. It was a peculiar odor, the kind you'd expect if you pressed too hard on the apples and accidentally crushed them. A strange mixture of damp, rot, and something Christine couldn't quite identify, but it gave her goosebumps. It struck her as odd, because on the surface the tree seemed fine. But on the inside, something was clearly wrong, and it showed in the fruit and the badly damaged leaves. It was heartbreaking to think that this tree must have been with the people who planted it, their children, and future generations who lived in the house. For those who had come and gone during its centuries-long existence, it would be sad to see the decline of a tree that had once been a playground for children, shaded summer afternoons, or provided apples for baking pies. Season after season, under its branches, it had witnessed countless moments. At first, she dismissed the idea of pruning, thinking it was just a bad season or a coincidence. So she let the days go by. But as she continued to check on it and make sure it was healthy, she noticed that the soil around the roots had become unusually dry and hard. It became increasingly clear that the tree was dying. The strange white fuzz covering some of the branches was unfamiliar to her and caused a deep sense of disgust, even if it wasn't immediately apparent. It was undeniable now. The tree wasn't just dying, it was sending warning signs. All the evidence pointed to the fact that the tree was sick with something, rotting from the inside. So she made the most sensible decision, to cut it down. With some reluctance, she picked up the phone and contacted a local lumberjack, someone known for his expertise with ancient trees. It was hard for her because it meant ending the life of a tree with such a significant legacy. The rotting fruit, the dry soil, and the branches covered in a strange fuzz left her with no choice. Not long after the call, the lumberjack arrived. After a brief conversation, he first determined if there was any way to save the tree. She let him examine it for a few minutes to confirm, as sometimes treatment is all that's needed. Unfortunately, he told her it wasn't possible. A little sad, she agreed. The woodcutter prepared his tools to cut it down. Just by looking at it, he had a good idea. Something inside was rotten and had caused everything else to rot. But to confirm it, it had to be cut down. It could be any kind of cause, which needed to be carefully investigated, as the deterioration could be divided into two main possibilities: either natural factors or those induced by human activity, which would be associated with any changes. One of the biggest possibilities he immediately considered was that the tree could have some kind of fungal disease, a silent threat to fruit trees, where fungi such as Botryosferia, Hypoxylon, and Phytophthora can enter through wounds in the bark, spread inside the tree, and cause diseases such as canker. This could explain the whole situation and how these pathogens weakened the internal structures, cut off the flow of water and nutrients, and left visible scars in the form of dark spots and necrotic areas on the bark. It was clear to him, but we wouldn't be here if there wasn't something else behind this tree. Something harmful. The man had no idea, though, as he thought it might simply be the result of extreme weather, as in recent decades, particularly in Cambridgeshire, England, climate change had caused cycles of prolonged drought, followed by torrential rain, eroding the soil and saturating the roots. But that wasn't the only thing that could cause serious damage. Although fruit trees may seem indestructible after decades of existence, they are very sensitive to conditions and lose the ability to adapt to drastic changes. This would eventually cause the soil around the tree to dry out or crack. The lumberjack had explained all this to her so that she would understand that it could be any of these factors, that any of these situations could be out of her hands. Or at least that was what he could say to make her not feel guilty, and at the same time help her to understand more deeply what was happening. The sound of the wood being chopped accompanied the moment and made her feel a constant sense of remorse. It could have been anything, but none of it would justify the police presence in the area later, because it could be something worse. Even something like buried money, drugs, or a body could change the composition of the soil and cause this. Finally, as the tree was being felled, she heard something. A loud, metallic noise. The lumberjack had hit something that would change everything she had imagined. It was a Tuesday, around 10 a.m., and the police station was quiet. One of the officers was dealing with a routine call when what he heard stunned him. Although the details were not clear, he understood exactly what he had heard, and it set off the alarm. He alerted the rest of the team, who immediately headed to the area where they had been informed of the discovery. A patrol car arrived at Christine's house, concerned, and with some equipment they approached cautiously until they met the woman and the lumberjack, who kindly led them to where they had been told something had been found. something that in another context would have been very valuable, but now posed a great danger to everyone. There was a grenade in the tree, a First World War grenade. Immediately, the officers realized that this was no joke. They were alarmed and called for reinforcements because this was a dangerous situation. Contrary to what the films show, grenades are not like explosives. They are much worse. There is an absurd amount of bullets inside, and when the switch is flipped, it explodes, scattering bullets everywhere and killing everyone instantly. But if it hits someone and they survive, it's highly unlikely they'll survive the hours. Getting such a grenade out would take a lot of work, so the officers immediately radioed all available units, while asking Christine and the lumberjack to move away from the area. They would have to set up a very tight perimeter to avoid any incidents. Several patrols arrived, alarming the neighborhood. Obviously, everyone gathered to hear that this was a high-risk area and that it needed to be cordoned off to prepare it for a specialist team to take over. But such specialists are not common, so they had to wait a while. So it was several hours before the patrols with the specialist team finally arrived. The people who had sneaked in to spy were removed from the area to avoid any casualties. It was already 3 p.m. and the team was accompanied by the same police chief who wanted to be present to investigate what was happening and to calm the area. By this time, Christine and the lumberjack were repeating their story, describing how they had found the object without venturing a conclusion. Finally, it was time for the bomb squad to move in. Having analysed the area and equipped themselves with protective suits and high-tech equipment, they began to treat the situation for what it was, a threat to public safety. The leaders' first action was to assess the measures they needed to take, as this type of operation is dangerous. The first tool they would use was a robotic camera to inspect the object without direct contact to ensure there was no immediate danger. They would then use sensors placed around the tree to detect any vibrations, as there was a risk that the wrong movement could cause some sort of damage. But that's not all. Once that was done, they began cutting the trunk in controlled sections without touching the object, thus reducing the risk of damage. Meanwhile, the rest of the team would continue to cordon off the area to ensure that no passers-by were at risk. With this in place, their work began. The risk was huge, as any wrong move or inappropriate action could cause an accidental explosion, which would be fatal to anyone in the vicinity. That's why there was probably a medical specialist on standby. But that was just one of their many concerns, as the grenade could contain toxins or something harmful that could cause further damage to the area and the personnel removing the bomb. At the same time, they had to ensure the integrity of the tree, as any misalignment could create excessive weight, which could cause an explosion. So it was a very delicate job, because they had to cut the tree in such a way that there wouldn't be any problems. The team was working carefully, taking into account any calculation errors that could occur. From the inspection to defining how they would cut the sections, and after verifying everything, they continued with their work. Of course, there was fear, as they didn't know if the grenade was damaged or not, so the risk was significant. After hours of meticulous work, they managed to cut the tree, moving on to the most important part, removing the grenade. With great attention to detail, they successfully extracted it and stored it in a container that would prevent any damage. They had done it. And Christine stood in front of a destroyed and felled tree. The man was indeed the cause of the tree's damage, but not in the way you might expect. It was the presence of a grenade inside that finally killed the tree and led to its disappearance. Nevertheless, she continues to look after her plants, as it is the least she can do to help nature.